The cameras were rolling inside CNN's studio on the morning of March 20th, 2026. The air was heavy with the kind of tension that only numbers can bring, the kind that does not bleed, does not fire a rifle, but cuts just as deep. On the screen, charts appeared like battle maps. On one side sat the towering approval ratings of men who had led the American war machine in times of great conflict. On the other side sat a single figure, buried deep in negative territory, like a soldier trapped in a foxhole with no reinforcements in sight. That figure was Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. CNN's chief data analyst Harry Enten stood his ground that morning the way a field correspondent stands in the middle of a war zone, steady, factual, and unflinching. What he delivered was not an opinion. It was an autopsy of public trust, conducted in real time, while the United States military was actively engaged in a war with Iran. The war had started on February 28, 2026, when the Trump administration launched coordinated strikes with Israel against Iran. Barely 3 weeks into that conflict, the eyes of the nation were not just on the battlefield. They were also on the man responsible for managing the most powerful military force on the planet. Polls were conducted around 2 weeks after the Trump administration launched its war against Iran, a period that historically has seen secretaries of defense gain popularity with the American public. But what the polls revealed about Hegseth broke every pattern in the historical record. According to new polling data from Quinnipiac and Yahoo, Hegseth's net popularity sat at -15, overall and -28 among independent voters per Quinnipiac. Yahoo's poll produced even lower figures, with Hegseth at -18 net popularity and a staggering -33 among independents. Enten laid out the data without ceremony. He spoke the way a soldier reads a map, precisely and without comfort. Past secretaries of defense at a time of war, this early into a conflict, tend to be very popular, Enten noted. He put up a slide showing Secretary of Defense net popularity figures at the early stages of previous American wars. What was on that slide rewrote the conversation entirely. Dick Cheney, who served as Secretary of Defense during the Gulf War, stood 62 points above water at that same early stage of conflict. Donald Rumsfeld, who would later become deeply unpopular due to the prolonged Iraq War and the Abu Ghraib scandal, was still 58 points above water at the beginning of the Iraq War. These were men who understood the weight of sending American soldiers into battle. When war began, the country rallied around them, even temporarily, as it historically does in moments of national urgency. Pete Hegseth was 17 points below water at the same stage of the Iran conflict. Enten made the comparison plain. Donald Rumsfeld was approximately 75 points more popular than Hegseth at a comparable point in their respective wars. Dick Cheney was nearly 80 points more popular. The distance between those numbers is not a gap, it is a canyon. Enten did not stop there. He pushed the historical comparison further into living memory. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, who served during Trump's first term, had a positive 37-point approval rating at a comparable point in the administration. Hegseth, by contrast, carried a negative 17-point rating. That placed Mattis more than 50 points ahead of Hegseth in net popularity at a similar stage. Mattis, widely known by the name Mad Dog, was a career military man, a 4-star general who had earned his standing through decades of service. The contrast between his reception and Hegseth's was not subtle. Enten made his conclusion clear. Pete Hegseth was truly unique when it came to secretaries of defense breaking records, except the record he was breaking was one of historic unpopularity at this point in a presidency. One of these things, Enten had said, was not like the others. To understand how Hegseth arrived at this point requires looking back further than the Iran War. His journey to the Pentagon had never been without resistance. When Trump first nominated him, as many as 6 Republican senators were not comfortable supporting Hegseth's bid to lead the Pentagon, as new revelations about his past continued to emerge. Given the Republican slim Senate majority, he could afford to lose only 3 GOP votes, assuming all Democrats voted against him. The confirmation battle was fierce. Allegations of misconduct, questions about drinking habits, and reports of financial mismanagement had followed Hegseth long before he ever set foot in the Pentagon as its leader. Enten had revealed earlier that Hegseth had never had a positive net favorability in any poll over the entire previous year, not once. Every single poll that could be found in the Roper Center archives had his net favorability in the negative from the moment Trump first nominated him. 0 positive polls. 0. Enten had said it the way a field commander delivers a grim report: plain, direct, final. That consistent negativity had made Hegseth a rare case in American political history. It was extremely unusual for a defense secretary to generate that much polling interest, especially when the country was not yet at war, Enten had noted earlier. The last time polling outfits paid that much attention to a defense secretary was during the tenure of Robert Gates, who served across 2 administrations and during an active period of war. Now there was a war, and the numbers had only gotten worse. Hegseth had taken on the role of the Trump administration's most vocal defender of the Iran conflict, attacking media outlets for their coverage and hammering European allies for their lack of military support. He called out what he described as a media narrative designed to make the country turn against the war, saying the coverage was making it seem as though, just 19 days into the conflict, the country was spiraling toward a forever war or a quagmire. But the data Enten presented that morning did not reflect a public being swayed by media narratives. It reflected something deeper, a settled skepticism that had been building around Hegseth since long before the first missile was fired at Iran. A Fox News poll from early March found Americans split at 50% on whether they approved of the Iran war at all. A separate Washington Post survey found that Americans opposed the strikes against Iran 52% to 39%. The war itself was not winning the country over, and the face most associated with prosecuting that war beyond the president was Pete Hegseth. David Smith, The Guardian's Washington bureau chief, observed that Hegseth represented a clear break from past defense secretaries who carried themselves as somber statesmen in times of war. The men who had come before him, the Cheneys, the Rumsfelds, the Mattisses, had all understood the weight of their office in ways the public could recognize, even when they disagreed with them. Hegseth carried a different kind of energy, more combative, more theatrical, more tethered to the political performance of the moment. The numbers on Enten's slide told that story quietly but completely. The same Yahoo/YouGov poll conducted between March 12th and 16th, already well into the Iran war with oil prices rising sharply, found that 67% of Americans disapproved of how Trump was handling the rapidly rising cost of living, with only 26% approving. The war was not existing in isolation. It was being felt in wallets, at gas stations, in grocery aisles, and the administration's messengers, including Hegseth, were absorbing the political consequences. Enten had noted that Hegseth was nearly 3 times more unpopular than Donald Trump himself at that stage. He stood as the least liked member of Trump's cabinet and the least liked Secretary of Defense since Rumsfeld's final, deeply troubled years at the Pentagon. The battle Hegseth was losing was not being fought on a runway or a naval deck or in the skies over Iran. It was being fought in the court of public opinion, where the weapons are polling numbers and approval ratings, and where the verdict is delivered not by generals but by ordinary Americans sitting at their kitchen tables, deciding what they think of the man overseeing their nation's military. On March 20th, 2026, Harry Enten stood in front of a CNN camera and laid out the evidence of that verdict with cold precision. The numbers were in. The history had been checked. And what remained, stark and undeniable, was the portrait of a Secretary of Defense unlike any who had come before him, not in achievement, but in the depth of his distance from the people he was meant to serve. The slide said everything. Pete Hegseth stood alone, 17 points below water, while the ghosts of Cheney and Rumsfeld and Mattis towered above him in the charts, each of them popular when their wars began, regardless of what came later. History, as Enten showed that morning, was watching, and history was not impressed.